we've been examining the architecture of tyranny, the anatomy of tyranny. Now we switch gears and start looking more at the anatomy of selfhood, because that is ultimately what we want to return to. Everything else is a subset of that. Other change is a subset of that. When the psyche split and the ego was born, it was born out of a necessity, the necessity to alleviate the trauma. It's classic. Split the mind, box it off, lock it up, put it in the attic, and carry on. That was the remedy at the time. But as any psychologist knows, that schizophrenia is not necessarily a solution to the problem, is it? You know, we made ourselves sicker. We were sick, we wanted to get away from it, and we made ourselves even sicker in the process of trying to try and find healing. But it's not true healing. And never to forget also that when I talk about a trauma, we are all individually smarting from it. It was yesterday, it was that short time ago. And so the human psyche is still reeling from the shock. But we start by shifting gears, and I want to introduce a word that, to me, other than know thyself, which I think is the greatest words ever written, and if you understand what the depth of what they mean, you can dispense with most of the scriptures of the world. And in fact, the scriptures are great because they even contain that very sentiment in them. But to me, one of the greatest, second greatest words in the human language is imagination. And perhaps we don't fully understand what is meant by that amazing term. Imagination is basically, it describes the landscape that is the eigenwelt. So all the processes in totality that go on within, and we'll look at them in more detail in a minute. Imagination is basically that kaleidoscope. Everybody's internal landscape is different. Some have a wintry landscape, some have a solar, you know, it's all different. No two people's inner landscape is the same by any means. Even though we've talked about the forces that come in to make it so. Imagination is in everyone. Even psychopaths have it. Ted Bundy had it. No matter how destructive you are, you have, in fact, one could say they have a bit of a their imaginations are a bit out of control, in fact. The point being that imagination is in everyone. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Everybody fantasizes, everybody has wish fulfillment, and a lot of us have a creative or spiritual drive as well. So it's there, even in the most destructive of people. It's a miraculous thing, and it's rarely marveled, rarely cherished. But the thing is that, just as an external landscape can be beautiful, as they are, or ugly, as the case may be, so can the inner landscape also be either beautiful or very ugly. Now, imagination, the properties of imagination are, of course, very miraculous. A stone doesn't sit thinking what it's like to be a man, but you, a man or woman, can contemplate or imagine what it's like to be a stone. You can imagine riding a horse even if you've never ridden one. You can imagine what it's like to go to the Crusades, or deep sea dive, or fly up into the stars. It allows you to project your consciousness into the future even, helping you to attain those goals that we spoke of earlier on. Nietzsche pointed out that, see, we don't create our own thoughts. They come to us out of the abyss. And God created the universe out of nothing. Thoughts are created every day out of nothing. He said it's almost presumptuous to say, I think. You're sort of taking the credit for something that almost happens spontaneously. There's another action going on. And so in other words, your imagination is when the universe is speaking to you. People speak to you from the outside. The universe communicates to you through the imagination body. The body being the receiver. The church father Origen said, you yourself are even another little world, and have within you the sun, the moon, and also the stars. William Blake, the English poet, said that in your own bosom you bear your heaven and earth, and all you behold. Though it appears without, it is within. In your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. He's not like some Eastern mystic saying, then pay no attention to this shadowy lower world. He doesn't mean that at all. He just said it's in contrast to what you can create for yourself within. The external world of what other people put together and other people create is of a lesser level. He goes on to say that the eternal body of man is the imagination. So that which is eternal within you is the imagination. The imagination, he says, rises from the mind's abyss and seeks more expanded senses than the five making up that abyss. If I had to say, yeah, I want to know what it is to ride a horse. If you have to physically go and find one, bring it in here, I've got to get on it, learn a bit, and then ride it, it takes time. You have to bring the horse across a certain distance. So time, distance, space, and speed are all involved in a physical act. In here, it's out of time. It happens instantaneously. I'm already doing it, but as soon as you think of it. And the imagination says, well, I could ride Pegasus, a white horse with wings across the sky, a creature that doesn't even exist. We've already transcended the limitations of time through the imagination. But Blake was aware, as others are aware, that opening the doors of perception, a lot of people don't want to do that. And he understood also that there was reasons why people didn't want to do that. Why would the toxic person open the doors to something that's going to make them feel even more foul and filthy? They don't want to open the door, the portal to the universal intelligence, because they might in fact suffer considerable mental derangement and breakdown from that activity. Now, D.W. Winnicott, a psychologist, American psychologist, said, can you see the one essential way in which science and intuition contrast with each other? True intuition can reach to a truth in a flash, whereas in science, the whole truth is never reached. So the other quality, remember we spoke about either in one short life with everything to know, you either give up knowing everything or you try something else, a completely different, quantum, spontaneous, holographic, holotropic download system. Or even perhaps, like Socrates said, there is no learning, it is all remembrance. You already are it. Sigmund Freud said, the decisive rules of logic don't apply in the unconscious. We could call it the empire of the illogical. It doesn't run along the same lines. That's why science can never fathom it. Robert Temple says that the beginnings of the concept of dissociation are commonly attributed to Pierre Janet in 1889. Janet's interpretation is that systems of ideas are split off from the major personality and exist as a subordinate personality, unconscious, but capable of becoming represented in consciousness through hypnosis. Janet was the first to introduce the term subconscious to refer to a level of cognitive functioning out of awareness that could on occasion become conscious. This non-conscious realm is the habitat, the abode of the imperial self we were talking about. It's partly a wasteland into which the imperial self has been thrown. Or alternatively, it is from that place that the imperial self speaks. It speaks from that realm. In 1898, the psychologist Dr. Morton Prince remarked on the possibility of there being, normally in all of us, a lower stratum of consciousness which is alive to everything about us while our upper minds are busy. Remember, the ego is facing outwards into the world. And by the way, the vast majority of Sigmund Freud's theories on the conscious and the unconscious and its dynamics, and even the libido and the will to power and all of these different concepts, are all prefigured in several philosophers that you know the name of, but it was never recognized. Freud's work was an enormous debt to, first of all, Arthur Schopenhauer, where almost every major Freudian concept is in Schopenhauer, and Freud read Schopenhauer, and secondly, Friedrich Nietzsche. And I'm not talking to a small degree, I mean to a very, very astounding degree. Just that's a side note. Now, Heraclitus, on the unconscious, said, you could not reach the ends of the psyche, though you went the whole way, so deep is its nature. So your compasses and protractors and meters and psychotherapies, all of this is merely surface. Freud himself said, nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious. Nothing is past and forgotten. He's talking about the ancestral wisdom reservoir, which contains, as I said, the scars and the wreck and ruin, but also something vastly more infinite than that, the whole reservoir of the world's experience. What kind of experience? We'll talk about in a minute. The greatest psychologist of that era, a man whose genius is hard to even put into words, George Grodek, again, largely unknown because of the work that he did. He was a pioneer of psychoanalysis, and you should look up his name and study him, because this man was absolutely incredible when it came to healing. Grodek says from his own book, the book of the It, which just means the book of the subconscious, the id, it must not be forgotten that the brain, and therefore the intellect, is itself created by the id. Long before the brain comes into existence, the it of man, right, the id, the subconscious, of man is already active in thinking without the brain, since it must first construct the brain before it can use it to think with. This is the fundamental point, and one we are inclined to ignore or forget. In the assumption that one thinks only with the brain is to be found the origin of 1,001 absurdities, the origin also of many invaluable discoveries and inventions, much that adorns life and much that makes it ugly. Positioning the brain as the center, nucleus, big mistake. Over and against the it, there stands the ego, that's the conscious mind, the I, which I take to be merely the tool of the it, but which we are forced by nature to regard as its master. So it makes a lot of noise, as we said. It's waving you over here, hey, I'm the boss. Actually, you're just the doorkeeper. The German philosopher Leibniz said that it is a great source of error to believe that there is no perception in the soul besides those of which it is conscious. So the unconscious concept goes way back. Theodore Roszak says the id is that very proto-human psychic core that our evolution has spent millions of years molding to fit the planetary environment. Its seeming unruliness deserves a deeper understanding, if only because it grows from a long evolutionary history. In the course of that history, its dominant characteristics must have been selected for some good reason. He's just saying that the thing is absolutely ancient. The ego is new, subjectivity is new, pathology is new. But we house an ancestral intelligence that is unmined, untapped, except by the few geniuses. Roszak goes on to say that id conserves from its long maturing process our treasury of ecological intelligence. Its intractability stems from its deeply ingrained resistance to all social forms that endanger the harmony of the human and the natural. Its untamed selfishness represents a bond between psyche and cosmos whose distant origins reach back to the initial conditions of the Big Bang. So the resistance, of the unconscious to being changed or being chained is because it has its own agenda. You can't invite an angel into a bird box. Just as there is a wisdom of the body, he says, which often has a better sense of health than medical science, so too there may be the wisdom of the id that knows what sanity is better than any school of psychiatry, whose standard of normality is essentially a defense of misconceived social necessity. Research has shown, this is Robert Temple saying this, research shows that even under deep hypnosis, part of the mind remains aware. Deep hypnosis. I don't know if most people even understand what that means. They have a grade. And this grade is very interesting because there's only certain suggestible types that can go into this deep form of hypnosis. But for years and years and years, they've studied them. And hypnotists have loosely referred to this deep, subtle field of awareness. Guess what? The self. Well, wait. Rewind. I thought there's no such thing as the self in the I. Or you'd meet the average common or garden skeptic going, that's all a bunch of crap. Well, too bad. The evidence has come in from you know who these people are? SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And their related orgs. Millions of dollars put into this. And they all finally come up with, don't really want to admit this, but guess we better. The self exists. And it's not a social construct. In fact, it resists all forms of control from the external. The term that they used for it is the hidden observer. When these people are put back into hypnotic trances, they know, they can sense, they can hear. It's not physical, of course, it's very remote, it's very intuitive, but they can hear the voice of the therapist to a certain point. And then they go deeper where that reality completely cuts off. And that's quite deep, that's very, very deep. Then they sense themselves, even under a state of hypnosis. And then they sense the other. And after a long period of time, they come up with the term the hidden observer. It's nothing more than the self. As for the deep self, presumed to be identical with Hilgard's hidden observer, standing partially outside of time, there is a great deal of evidence for this phenomenon. Well, shit, guess they just forgot to tell us that in school, huh? Bit of an oversight. Just forgivable. Bashing you over the head with the Bible and everything else, but just forgot to tell you you are it. The fullest account of it is in the remarkable book, Divided Consciousness, by one of America's most noted psychologists, Professor Ernest Hilgard. In his book, Hilgard points out that the very word profound comes from the Latin profundus, meaning near the bottom. Near the bottom? Well, the bottom, what have the Christians done to up and down and bottom and I? Near the bottom is, ooh, that's all Dante's Inferno, Bela Lugosi and all that. Yay. Now we find out the abode of the self is down below, as so many legends and myths had said. Greg D. Jacobs, another one of these insiders who's forced, by the way, you can really see this when you read the book, good as it is in parts. They got no choice left. It's not because these people are not saying this stuff because they want to, it's because they bloody well have to. Because the other paradigm has run aground badly. It's been shot full of holes. So Greg Jacobs, right, in his book, he calls it the ancestral mind. The ancestral mind arose long before logic or language appeared, and because it came online first, it has maintained its ability to operate as a separate system, quite independent of the thinking mind. The ancestral mind learned to communicate emotional information intuitively, non-verbally, and non-consciously over the course of millions of years. Pity his forebears in the universities didn't admit this. And much of the emotional communication between people today is still non-verbal and unconscious. It was the work of neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux that provided the physiological evidence for the key role played by the unconscious processing in our emotional life. His research not only confirmed the functioning of the ancestral mind, quite apart from the thinking mind, but also demonstrated that the brain itself gives priority to unconscious messages from this older part of us. Jung says, we know that the mask, remember we earlier said that a vast majority of the people in the world, for very clear reasons to them, don't want any contact with that realm. That's why we're all living out here entangled in the domestic minutiae. Jung explains why. He says, we know that the mask of the unconscious isn't rigid. It reflects the face we turn toward it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. There you are. It's specular. It's specular. It's purely magical. If you approach it with false curiosity, fear, anxiety, anger, aggressiveness, evil intent, you'll meet demons. And they do. If you turn the other face towards it, of confidence, love, understanding, you see, and fearlessness, you meet your angels. But that is a wall. That is Chakari. That is the place of the final frontier. To cross over there, you will stand on the ground that will morph under your feet into what you are. Right? Saibak met himself and wept that he had been duped. So it is with us. The face we meet of God is our projection of ourselves. So if you go in there with the wrong intent, watch out. And that is why that realm is closed off to a vast majority of people in this world. Because this one statement is absolutely monumental. It's one of the greatest statements anybody could make. Because it throws all these lies about the unconscious and the soul into the dirt. That thing is mercurial in every sense of the word. Jung says it. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls. Then I have a question about those kinds of people. And we'll be exploring exactly that kind of person in Age of Manipulation 3, in Psychic Vampirism. Nietzsche says, look, why does man not see things as they are? Because he himself is standing in the way. He conceals things. The surrealist artist Magritte said that everything we want to look at conceals something else we want to look at. Again, talking about the unusualness of perception. But what is Nietzsche talking about? He's talking about the social persona. That's what stands in the way, right? That pseudo-self, that counterfeit self, is standing in the way of a direct relationship with things. Back to the main theme, because this is the key to freedom, how to unlock this antipathy to nature, which has caused so much pain and destruction and aggression in the world. Again, as we say, it came from the prehistoric trauma. Not only does this concept allow us to improve upon those psychological theories, as we said, instead of shame and guilt, we can track this whole thing back to antipathy to nature. But as I alluded to before, it goes much deeper than just antipathy to nature. Given that we finally click, we twig it, that self and nature are one. So it's a Ouroboros. The antipathy to nature is ultimately, as you just heard, they've all talked about how the mind, our mind, was fashioned over millions of years by what? Nature. It is nature. The body is obviously nature. We didn't create it. So in this antipathy that, yes, ostensibly, technically, is externalized to nature itself, it is ultimately reflected in our relationship to ourselves. It's reciprocal. It's a feedback loop. And that is a certainty. It's not negotiable. That antipathy towards nature is antipathy towards the self, and this is the fall. This is the true fall, the fall from nature. Rollo May says that self implies world and world self. There is neither without the other. And each is understandable only in terms of the other. The German rationalist philosopher Friedrich Schelling said it in fantastic term. He said, fantastic way, nature is visible spirit. Spirit is invisible nature. One could say in New Age terminology, nature around you is your Merkaba, your aura. Everyone talks about auras. Well, your aura is the whole universe of which you were always at the center. Every single human being occupies the center of the universe. By the way, the Native American Indians understood this with their medicine wheel. And it happens to be a fact. Obviously, the trauma that started all of this, including the genetic interference, is many thousands of years ago. Whether it was 13,500 or 50, it's really irrelevant, isn't it? So we can't physically, in some sort of Doctor Who scenario, go back physically to that place and undo the knot. That's fiction. And as a matter of fact, you don't even have to. There's other ways to collapse time. Remember that thing we started off with? The imagination. Now you're going to find out how important it is. And why it's so absolutely superior to any form of technology. Is because that imagination that can do things with time, right, allows you not to go back in time, but to bring the trauma here to you now. You do the opposite. It's like something out of the martial arts. We can't go back physically, but we can bring the trauma to consciousness here, where we are now. Bring it in front of us. Call it in front of you to deal with it. Once you know that it is a problem, right? So you don't regress. That's deadly. Some people have tried that. The Jim Morrison types, those who plunge in, to swim around in the abyss. I understand it. I understand it. But it doesn't work. Because the waters are too powerful. The river Leve is too powerful. Thor had to hang on to dear life to the rowan tree because the gales were blowing him away. So the rowan became sacred to the Arya because the god clung to it for dear life as he negotiated the trials of the underworld. Odin lost an eye. Horus lost an eye. Mortally wounded. Mortally wounded. You don't need to do that. You don't regress, you invert. You bring the trauma back. And you do that by simply stepping out into nature and say hello. Because nature is eternal. Nature is timeless. So even though the trauma that existed that made the rend between us, right, was technically, historically a long time ago, it certainly wasn't in our personal life, so what, are we just stuck with it then? No. Each individual has imagination, this ability to constellate and concertina the time of history and go out, not the surf, bungee jump and skydive, or do the other preposterous bullshit that people do when they walk out into nature so their dog can take a piss. No, no, no. This going out is different. This day, you leave the fishing rod behind. This day you go for the first time as if you were doing it millennia ago. And you open dialogue, ultimately with yourself, but you do it to nature, to her. You go and say, hello, I'm back. And you will be. The moment that you do it, you will be, because she's waiting to talk to you. The conversation is long overdue, but she's very, very patient and has waited for each one of us to return. And you sit down and you have a tete-a-tete under the stars or under the sun, it's your choice. Beside the sea, on a rock, under a mushroom, wherever you want to do. It's your garden, it's your place. You pick the time and you go. It's not the going, it is the way that you go. Because that is the unconscious that we spoke of just a few minutes ago. So when you walk into it, how you walk is of unimaginable importance. The whole thing rests in how you walk that road. If you want the right angels to come, don't you have to signal the right call? Don't you have to press the right button? Don't you have to sing the right song? Now,